The helicopter's blades cut through the thick Afghan air like a sword through silence, carrying 12 of America's finest warriors toward what intelligence had called a routine extraction. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window, watching the rugged mountains below disappear into shadows as the sun began its descent behind the peaks. His team, Delta Squad, had been together for 3 years now, and they moved like a single organism, each man knowing exactly where the others would be before they even moved. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, barely audible over the thunderous roar of the rotors. Morrison glanced at his men. There was Rodriguez, their communications specialist, checking his equipment for the 5th time with the same methodical precision that had kept them alive through 17 missions. Next to him sat Thompson, the youngest of the group at 24, but already bearing the weathered look of someone who had seen too much too young. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They had stopped doing that after his 3rd deployment. Across from him, Williams was cleaning his rifle with movements so smooth they looked like a dance, while Carter stared ahead with the 1,000-yard stare they all knew too well. The mission briefing had been simple enough. Intel suggested a high-value target was holed up in a compound about 15 miles from the Pakistani border. The area had been under surveillance for weeks, and satellite images showed minimal civilian presence. Get in, neutralize or capture the target, gather intelligence, and get out. Standard procedure for a team that had done this more times than they cared to count. But as Morrison looked at the faces of his men, he felt that familiar knot in his stomach that always came before something went wrong. Call it intuition, call it experience, but after 8 years in special operations, he had learned to trust that feeling. The intelligence seemed too clean, too convenient. High-value targets didn't usually make themselves so easy to find, especially not in an area where American forces had been conducting operations for months. 30 seconds came the pilot's voice again, and Morrison could feel the helicopter beginning its descent. The compound appeared below them like a small cluster of mud brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard. From above, it looked exactly like the satellite photos, too exactly, Morrison thought. The buildings were dark, no lights visible anywhere, no movement in the courtyard. For a moment, the only sound was the steady thrum of the helicopter's engine and the collective breathing of 12 highly trained warriors preparing to drop into an unknown situation. Remember, we go in quiet. Morrison spoke into his microphone, his voice calm despite the growing unease in his chest. Rodriguez, you set up comms on the North Ridge. Thompson and Williams, you take the rear entrance. Carter, you're with me on the main building. Everyone else, standard perimeter formation. The helicopter hovered 20 feet above the ground, and one by one, the SEALs rappelled down their ropes with practiced efficiency. Morrison was the last to touch down, his boots hitting the dusty ground with barely a whisper. Around him, his team had already melted into their assigned positions, shadows moving with purpose through the darkness. The compound was even quieter up close. Too quiet. No dogs barking, no sounds of daily life that should have been present even late in the evening. The silence was thick and oppressive, like a blanket that muffled even their careful footsteps. Morrison hand-signaled to Carter, and together they approached the main building, their weapons ready but not raised, still maintaining the pretense that this might be a peaceful encounter. The door to the main building was slightly ajar, which immediately set off alarm bells in Morrison's head. In a culture where privacy and security were paramount, especially in a region where foreign soldiers regularly conducted raids, no one left their door open. He paused, listening for any sound from inside, but heard nothing except the slight whistle of wind through the courtyard. Through his earpiece, he heard Rodriguez's voice, comms established. No radio chatter in the area. Seems clear from up here. Thompson's voice followed. Rear entrance is locked, but I can see light under the door. Someone's definitely inside. Morrison made his decision. They had come this far, and intelligence suggested their target was valuable enough to justify the risk. He pushed the door open slowly, Carter covering him from behind, and stepped into the building. The interior was sparse but clean, with traditional Afghan furnishings and carpets covering most of the floor. A small oil lamp provided the only light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Morrison moved forward carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, when he heard it, a soft sound that made his blood run cold. It was crying, not the harsh sobbing of an adult, but the quiet, hiccuping cry of a child trying very hard not to make any noise. Morrison froze, his weapon lowering slightly as he tried to process what he was hearing. The intelligence had been clear, minimal civilian presence. No mention of families, no mention of children. But the sound was unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. "Sir!" Carter's voice was barely a whisper behind him. Morrison held up his hand for silence, straining his ears. The crying seemed to be coming from a room at the back of the building, beyond what looked like a kitchen area. He moved forward slowly, each step careful and deliberate, until he could see around the corner into the back room. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. Huddled in the corner of the room were 7 people, 3 women, 2 elderly men, and 2 children who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. They were pressed together like frightened animals, their eyes wide with terror in the lamplight. One of the women held a baby against her chest, and it was the baby's crying that he had heard. But it wasn't just the presence of civilians that made Morrison's stomach drop. It was the way they were looking at him. These weren't just frightened people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. These were people who had been expecting this. They were dressed in their best clothes, as if they had been waiting for someone important. The men's beards were freshly trimmed, the women's head coverings were arranged with care, and the children's faces were clean despite their obvious terror. This was a setup. Morrison's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. If this was a trap, where was the threat? Why would someone use civilians, especially children, as bait? And why did these people look like they were prepared for a formal meeting rather than cowering in fear from an unexpected raid? One of the women, apparently the eldest, began speaking in rapid Pashto, her voice shaking but determined. Morrison didn't speak the language fluently, but he caught enough words to understand that she was begging for something. Not for their lives. She was begging for something else, something that didn't make sense in the context of a military raid. Through his earpiece, Rodriguez's voice cut through his confusion. "Sir, we've got movement on the perimeter. Multiple heat signatures approaching from the east. They're moving fast and in formation." Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. This was it. This was the trap. But why use civilians? Why put innocent people, children, in the middle of what was clearly about to become a firefight? "All units, prepare for contact," he spoke quietly into his microphone. "We have civilians in the main building. I repeat, multiple civilians, including children." The response from his team was immediate. These men had trained for this scenario, but training was different from reality. In training, you could reset and try again. In reality, every decision could mean the difference between life and death, not just for them, but for the innocent people caught in the middle. Thompson's voice came through the comm. "Sir, the light under the door just went out. I think they know we're here." Williams reported next. "Movement confirmed on the south side as well. We're about to be surrounded." Morrison looked at the civilians huddled in the corner, then at Carter, whose face reflected his own confusion and growing dread. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Intelligence failures were one thing, but this felt deliberate. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had arranged for these families to be here when the shooting started. The eldest woman was still speaking, her voice more urgent now, and Morrison caught one word that made his blood freeze: "Doctor." She was saying "doctor" over and over again, pointing toward one of the other women in the group. Before he could process what that meant, the first shots rang out from somewhere outside the building. The sharp crack of automatic weapons' fire shattered the night silence, followed immediately by the answering fire from his team's weapons. The civilians pressed themselves even further into the corner, the children beginning to scream in terror. Contact! Multiple hostiles approaching from all sides. Rodriguez's voice was calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "They're using the other buildings for cover." Morrison had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. His team was under attack, probably outnumbered, and they had a building full of innocent people who would be caught in the crossfire. Everything in his training told him to get his men to a defensible position and call for extraction, but leaving these people behind would almost certainly mean their deaths. "Carter, get these people to the back room and keep them down," Morrison ordered. "I'm going to help establish a perimeter." But as he turned to leave, the eldest woman grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and when he looked down at her, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just fear. It was determination and something else, recognition. She spoke again in Pashto, but this time slower, more clearly, and Morrison felt his world shift as he understood what she was saying. She wasn't just pointing to one of the women and saying doctor. She was telling him that one of the women was their doctor, their healer, and that she had been waiting for them to arrive. The woman she was pointing to looked up at Morrison, and for a moment their eyes met across the chaos of gunfire and screaming. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes that held a calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. She said something in English, her accent thick, but her words clear. "I can help. Your men. I can help." Morrison stared at her, trying to process what was happening. This woman, this civilian doctor, had somehow known they were coming. She had been waiting for them, prepared to help with wounded. The setup wasn't a trap meant to kill them. It was a trap meant to save them. But from what? The answer came 30 seconds later when Thompson's voice crackled through the comm, tight with pain. "I'm hit. Rodriguez, I need cover." And that was when Morrison realized that this night was going to be unlike any mission he had ever been on. As he looked at the woman who had just offered to help his wounded teammate, he saw something in her eyes that he recognized from the mirror every morning. The look of someone who had seen too much violence and dedicated their life to fighting it in the only way they knew how. The gunfire outside was getting heavier, and he could hear his men calling for each other, their voices tight with the controlled fear that came with being outnumbered and under attack. But for just a moment, in that back room with 7 strangers who had been waiting for him to arrive, Morrison felt like he was seeing the first piece of a puzzle that was much bigger and more complicated than anyone had told him. The gunfire erupted in waves that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mud brick building. Morrison could hear the distinct sounds of his team's weapons mixed with the sharper cracks of AK-47s and what sounded like at least 2 machine gun positions. Through the small window, muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireworks, creating a strobe effect that made everything seem surreal. "Thompson's bleeding bad, sir." William's voice came through the comm, strained with the effort of speaking while under fire. "That woman, if she's really a doctor, we need her now." Morrison looked at the young woman who had spoken English. She had moved slightly away from the group of terrified civilians and was already reaching for what appeared to be a medical bag that had been hidden behind some blankets. Her movements were calm and purposeful, completely at odds with the chaos erupting around them. "You're a doctor?" Morrison asked quickly, having to raise his voice over the sound of incoming rounds hitting the exterior walls. "Yes," she replied, her English clearer now that she was speaking louder. "Dr. Amira Hassan. I trained at Kabul Medical University before." She paused, ducking slightly as a particularly loud burst of gunfire rattled the windows. Before the Taliban made it impossible for women to practice medicine openly, Carter was pressed against the wall next to the window, occasionally returning fire at muzzle flashes in the darkness. "Sir, they got us pinned down pretty good. Rodriguez is trying to call for extraction, but there's some kind of signal interference." Morrison's mind was racing. This woman, Dr. Hassan, had known they were coming. That much was clear. But how? And why was she here with her family, or what he assumed was her family, waiting for American soldiers to arrive? The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but the bigger mystery was becoming impossible to ignore. "How did you know we were coming?" Morrison asked Dr. Hassan directly, while motioning for Carter to keep watch. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, The sound of gunfire seemed to fade into background noise. "Because I sent the message," she said simply. "The intelligence about your target. I provided it." Morrison felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "You're the source." Before she could answer, Rodriguez's voice burst through the comm with barely controlled panic. "All units, we've got a problem. Thompson's unconscious. Williams is trying to stop the bleeding, but we're taking heavy fire from 3 sides. They're using rocket-propelled grenades now." As if to emphasize the point, an explosion rocked the building, sending dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. One of the children screamed, and the elderly woman began praying in rapid, whispered Arabic. Dr. Hassan was already moving, checking the contents of her medical bag. "I need to get to your wounded soldier," she said firmly. "Where is he?" "Behind the building, about 30 yards north." Morrison replied automatically, then caught himself. "But you can't go out there. It's a war zone." "Yes, I can," she said, looking at him with an expression that brooked no argument. "This is what I do. This is why I've been waiting." Morrison stared at her, trying to understand. "Waiting for what?" "For you to come so I could help you leave," she said, then added something that made his blood run cold. "Before they kill all of us." The pieces were starting to come together in Morrison's mind, but none of them made a complete picture. Dr. Hassan had somehow lured them here with intelligence about a high-value target, but the target was apparently her, or rather, the fact that she was providing information to American forces. The attack wasn't random. It was specifically designed to eliminate her along with any Americans who might have been working with her. "You're the target," Morrison said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The intelligence was about you being here, not about capturing someone." She nodded grimly. "The Taliban discovered I was passing medical intelligence to coalition forces. Information about wounded fighters, where they were being treated, who was helping them. I thought I was careful, but..." She gestured toward the gunfire outside. "Apparently not careful enough." Another explosion, closer this time, sent cracks spiderwebbing across the wall. Carter returned fire through the window, then ducked back down. "Sir, we need to move. This building isn't going to provide cover much longer." Through his earpiece, Morrison heard Williams' voice, tight with stress. "Thompson's pulse is getting weaker. He's lost a lot of blood. If we don't get medical attention soon..." Dr. Hassan was already standing, slinging her medical bag across her shoulder. "I'm going to him," she said, not asking for permission. "No," Morrison said firmly. "It's too dangerous. The moment you step outside, you become a target." "I'm already a target," she replied calmly. "The difference is that your soldier is dying while we waste time talking." Morrison looked at this woman, this stranger who had somehow become central to everything that was happening, and saw something that reminded him of his own man. It was the look of someone who had made peace with the possibility of death in service of something larger than themselves. But before he could respond, the eldest woman from the group in the corner spoke urgently in Pashto. Dr. Hassan listened, then turned back to Morrison with an expression that had grown even more serious. "My aunt says the fighters outside aren't just Taliban," she translated. "Some of them are foreign. Arabs, maybe Chechens. This isn't just about stopping me from providing information to Americans. This is about making an example." The implications hit Morrison immediately. Foreign fighters meant this was potentially an international incident. It meant these weren't just local militants trying to solve a local problem. This was organized, probably funded, and directed from outside Afghanistan. And it meant that extracting his team and these civilians had just become exponentially more complicated. "How many people know you're here?" Morrison asked. "Just my family," Dr. Hassan replied. "But they've been watching us for days. They know exactly who is in this building." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm again. "Sir, I've got eyes on at least 20 fighters, maybe more. They're setting up what looks like a perimeter to keep us from leaving, but they're not pushing hard to get in. It's like they're waiting for something." Morrison's stomach dropped as he realized what they might be waiting for. "Sunrise," he said aloud. "They're waiting for daylight so they can make sure they don't miss anyone when they finish this." Dr. Hassan nodded grimly. And so anyone who finds our bodies will see exactly what happens to people who help Americans. The tactical picture was becoming clear, and it wasn't good. Morrison's team was outnumbered, low on ammunition, cut off from reinforcements, and responsible for protecting 7 civilians, including 2 children. The enemy wasn't in a hurry because they controlled the situation completely. They could wait until dawn, then eliminate everyone systematically. But there was something else, something that Dr. Hassan had said that was nagging at Morrison's mind. She had been passing medical intelligence to coalition forces. That meant she had contacts, communication methods, people who knew she was valuable, people who might be able to help. The intelligence you were passing, Morrison said urgently. Who was your contact? A man called Johnson. CIA, I think, though he never said so directly. We would meet at the medical clinic in Kandahar. Morrison knew Johnson, at least he knew of him. The CIA maintained a network of medical contacts throughout Afghanistan, people who could provide information about wounded insurgents and foreign fighters receiving treatment. It was valuable intelligence, but dangerous for anyone involved on the local side. When did you last have contact with Johnson? 3 days ago. I told him I thought my position was compromised. He said he would arrange for extraction, but she gestured around the building. I don't think this is what he had in mind. Morrison was starting to understand the bigger picture, and he didn't like what he saw. Dr. Hassan had been a valuable intelligence asset, providing information that had probably saved American lives. When her position became compromised, someone, probably Johnson, had arranged for a special operations team to extract her. But the intelligence had been intercepted or compromised, turning what should have been a rescue operation into a trap. Thompson's voice came weakly through Williams' microphone. Sir, I don't think I'm going to make it. Tell my mom. Shut up, Thompson. Williams cut him off. You're going to tell her yourself. But we need that doctor now. Dr. Hassan was already moving toward the door. I can't wait any longer. If your soldier dies because I was too scared to help him, I'll never forgive myself. Morrison grabbed her arm, but gently. If you go out there, you'll probably die. These people came here specifically to kill you. She looked at him with eyes that were sad but determined. Mr. Morrison, yes, I know your name from Johnson's briefings. I became a doctor because I believe in preserving life. All life. American, Afghan, Taliban, it doesn't matter to me. Your soldier is dying, and I have the skills to save him. Everything else is secondary. Morrison stared at her, recognizing the same dedication he saw in his own men. This woman was willing to risk everything to save the life of a stranger, someone from a foreign army in a foreign country. It was the kind of courage that transcended nationality, religion, or politics. But it was also the kind of courage that got good people killed. Through the window, Carter reported quietly, movement in the courtyard. Looks like they're positioning for something. Maybe preparing to rush the building. Morrison had to make a decision, and every option seemed impossible. Let Dr. Hassan risk her life to save Thompson, or watch a good soldier die while keeping her safe. Try to fight their way out with wounded and civilians, or wait for an extraction that might never come. Trust this woman who had somehow become the center of everything, or stick to standard operating procedure and treat her as just another civilian to be protected. Looking at Dr. Hassan's determined face, Morrison realized that maybe the choice wasn't his to make. Maybe some people were willing to risk everything for what they believed in, and maybe his job wasn't to protect her from that choice, but to support her in making it. Carter, he said quietly, you're going to provide cover. Dr. Hassan is going to Thompson. The look of gratitude and respect in her eyes told him he had made the right decision, even if he wasn't sure they would all live to see morning. The next 30 minutes would later be described by Rodriguez as the longest half hour of controlled chaos he had ever experienced. Dr. Hassan had insisted on going to Thompson despite the obvious danger, and Morrison had made the tactical decision to support her. What happened next changed everything, not just for the mission, but for how every man in Delta Squad would think about courage for the rest of their lives. Dr. Hassan moved through the building toward the back exit with the fluid confidence of someone who had navigated dangerous situations before. Morrison followed, with Carter providing rear security. As they reached the door that led to where Thompson lay wounded, Morrison could hear Williams talking to his injured teammate in the steady, reassuring tone that combat medics use to keep wounded soldiers conscious. "Talk to me, Thompson. Tell me about that girl back home. Sarah, right? What's she studying in college?" Thompson's voice was weak, but audible, pre-med. "She wants to be a doctor like her dad." Dr. Hassan paused at those words, looking at Morrison with an expression that was impossible to read. Then, she checked her medical bag one more time and moved to the door. "On my mark," Morrison whispered into his comm, "Rodriguez, we need suppressing fire on the east and south positions. Williams, we're coming to you." "Copy that, sir." Thompson's conscious, but his blood pressure is dropping. "We need to move fast." Morrison looked at Dr. Hassan. In the dim light filtering through the doorway, he could see that her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. Whatever fear she was feeling, she was channeling it into focus rather than panic. It was the same transformation he had seen in his own men during their first combat experience. The moment when training took over and fear became a tool rather than an obstacle. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Rodriguez, light them up. Now." The night exploded with gunfire as Rodriguez opened up with sustained bursts from his position on the ridge. The distinctive sound of his M249 was answered immediately by return fire, but the enemy muzzle flashes shifted away from their building as the fighters focused on the new threat. Morrison pushed open the door, and Dr. Hassan bolted through it, moving in a low crouch toward the position where Williams had dragged Thompson behind a low stone wall. Morrison followed, providing cover, while Carter remained at the door to ensure their retreat route stayed open. What Morrison saw when they reached Thompson made his stomach clench. The young SEAL was pale and sweating despite the cool night air, and there was too much blood on the ground around him. Williams had managed to apply a pressure bandage to what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the upper thigh, but it was clear that the bleeding hadn't been completely stopped. Dr. Hassan didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside Thompson and immediately began examining the wound with gentle but efficient movements. "What's your name?" she asked Thompson, her English clear despite having to speak loudly over the ongoing gunfire. "Thompson. Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Thompson." "Marcus, I'm Dr. Hassan. I'm going to take care of you, but I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me." "Can you do that?" Thompson nodded weakly. "Yes, ma'am." What happened next was something that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. Dr. Hassan opened her medical bag and began working on Thompson's wound with a skill and precision that was remarkable under any circumstances, but seemed almost miraculous given that they were in the middle of a firefight. Her hands moved with steady confidence as she assessed the damage, applied new pressure to control bleeding, and began preparing what appeared to be sutures. "The bullet went through cleanly," she reported to Williams, who was providing security while she worked. "No major arteries hit, but he's lost significant blood. Do you have 4 fluids?" Williams looked at Morrison, confusion clear on his face even in the darkness. Standard special operations medics carried limited supplies, not the kind of equipment that would be needed for major trauma care. Dr. Hassan seemed to understand the problem without explanation. From her medical bag, she produced an 4-bag and tubing. "I came prepared," she said simply, then looked directly at Morrison. "Johnson told me that American Special Operations soldiers sometimes get wounded far from medical help. I thought I might be able to assist." Morrison stared at her as the implications sank in. This woman hadn't just been providing intelligence to the CIA. She had been preparing to provide medical support to American forces. She had spent her own money, risked her own safety to obtain medical supplies that she might need to save the lives of foreign soldiers. "Williams, help her with whatever she needs," Morrison ordered, then spoke into his comm. "Rodriguez, how are we looking?" "They're backing off a bit, but not retreating," Rodriguez replied. "I think they're regrouping. We probably have a few minutes before they try something else." Those few minutes turn out to be exactly what Dr. Hassan needed. Working by the light of William's red-filtered flashlight, she managed to stop Thompson's bleeding, establish a four-line, and stabilize his condition enough that he was no longer in immediate danger of bleeding to death. But as she worked, something remarkable happened. Thompson, despite his pain and blood loss, began asking her questions. Not medical questions, but personal ones. "Ma'am, why are you helping us? I mean, we're American soldiers in your country." Dr. Hassan continued working as she answered. "Because you're hurt, and I'm a doctor. It's that simple. But we're strangers. Foreign soldiers. Our countries are at war." She paused in her work for just a moment, looking at Thompson's face. "Marcus, when I was in medical school, I took an oath. It's called the Hippocratic Oath, and part of it says first, do no harm. But there's another part that people sometimes forget. I will treat without exception all who seek my aid. It doesn't say all who are from my country or all who share my religion. It says all who seek my aid." Thompson was quiet for a moment, then said, "My girlfriend wants to be a doctor. I hope she turns out like you." Morrison felt something tighten in his chest as he listened to this exchange. Here was an American soldier and an Afghan doctor from different worlds, different cultures, different sides of a complex conflict, finding common ground in the simple recognition that healing was more important than harm. But the moment was interrupted by Rodriguez's voice. "Sir, we've got a problem. Looks like they're bringing up something heavy. Maybe a recoilless rifle or RPG. If they get that set up, this building won't provide cover anymore." Morrison looked at Dr. Hassan, who was just finishing her work on Thompson. The young SEAL was looking much better. His color had improved, and he was alert enough to be complaining about the four-line. "Can he be moved?" Morrison asked. "In a few minutes, yes. But carefully. He shouldn't be running or jumping for at least." Her words were cut off by the unmistakable whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. Morrison threw himself over Dr. Hassan and Thompson just as the explosive round hit the far corner of the building they had just been in. The explosion was deafening, and chunks of mud brick and debris rained down on them. When the dust settled, Morrison could hear Carter's voice through the comm. "Strained but calm. Building's compromised. The whole back wall is gone, and there's a fire starting. We need to move the civilians." Morrison looked at Dr. Hassan, who was checking Thompson for any new injuries from the explosion debris. Her medical bag had been scattered by the blast, but she was systematically gathering her supplies with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the entire night. "Can you get your family ready to move?" Morrison asked her. "Where would we go?" She replied practically. "They have us surrounded, and now they know exactly where we are." It was a good question, and Morrison didn't have a good answer. Standard extraction procedures assumed helicopter pickup from a secure landing zone, but their current position was neither secure nor suitable for helicopter operations. They needed a new plan, and they needed it quickly. That was when Dr. Hassan said something that changed everything. "There's a medical clinic about 2 kilometers north of here. It's run by an international aid organization. If we could reach it, they wouldn't dare attack us there. Too many witnesses, too much international attention." Morrison considered this. 2 kilometers through hostile territory, with wounded soldiers and civilians, including children. It seemed impossible, but staying put was definitely impossible. "How do you know about this clinic?" Morrison asked. "Because I used to work there," Dr. Hassan replied. "Before the Taliban made it too dangerous for local women to be associated with international organizations." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm again. "Sir, we've got vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like they're bringing reinforcements." Morrison made his decision. "All units, prepare to move. We're heading north to an aid clinic. Rodriguez, can you lay down covering fire for a general withdrawal?" "Affirmative, but I can't hold them off indefinitely." Morrison looked at Dr. Hassan, who was helping Thompson to his feet with William's assistance. "Are you sure about this clinic?" She met his eyes with the same calm determination he had seen throughout the night. "Yes, but there's something you should know." "What?" "Getting there means crossing through the village. These people," she gestured toward where a family was gathered, "they're not just my relatives. They're the village council. They've been protecting me, hiding the fact that I was working with Americans. If we're going to reach the clinic, we'll need their help. Morrison realized that this mission had become something far more complicated than a simple extraction. These weren't just random civilians caught in crossfire. There were people who had been actively helping American intelligence operations at great personal risk. They deserve protection not just as non-combatants, but as allies. Looking at Thompson, who was now standing with Dr. Hassan's support, Morrison made a decision that would affect the rest of his military career. We all go together, or none of us go. No one gets left behind. Dr. Hassan smiled at him, the first time he had seen her smile since the night began. Johnson told me that American soldiers never leave anyone behind. I wasn't sure if it was true. It's true, Thompson said weakly but clearly. Always has been. And as Morrison began planning their movement to the clinic, he realized that the story of this night would be remembered not for the tactical situation or the intelligence value, but for the moment when a group of strangers became a team, united by something more important than nationality or politics: the simple determination to make sure everyone made it home alive. The journey to the medical clinic would later be described in Morrison's after-action report as a tactical movement through hostile territory with multiple non-combatants. But those dry military words couldn't capture what actually happened during those 2 hours before dawn. What happened was something that transcended the boundaries of war, nationality, and the simple categories of friend and enemy that military training relied upon. The group that emerged from the burning building was unlike anything Morrison had ever led before. There were his 5 remaining SEALs: himself, Carter, Williams, Rodriguez, and the wounded but mobile Thompson. Then there were the 7 Afghan civilians: Dr. Hassan, her aunt and uncle, a cousin with her 2 young children, and an elderly man who turned out to be the village imam. 9 adults, 2 children, and enough complexity to make any military commander's head spin. But as they prepared to move, Morrison discovered something that changed his understanding of everything that had happened. Dr. Hassan's family weren't just relatives who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were the core of an intelligence network that had been providing information to coalition forces for over 2 years. My uncle was a translator for American forces until 2018, Dr. Hassan explained quietly as they prepared to leave the building. My aunt managed a women's literacy program funded by USAID. The imam has been reporting on foreign fighters who came to the village seeking shelter. We've all been working together. Morrison stared at her, the implications sinking in. You're telling me this whole village has been supporting American operations? Not the whole village, but many people. Those who believe that education, medical care, and economic development were better than endless war. Williams, who was helping Thompson check his weapon, looked up sharply. Ma'am, if that's true, then what's happening tonight isn't just about you. They're trying to eliminate an entire intelligence network. Dr. Hassan nodded grimly. And make an example that will discourage others from cooperating with Americans. The tactical picture was becoming even more complex, but Morrison realized that it also provided opportunities. If these people had been supporting American operations for years, they would know the local terrain, the safest routes, and potentially even which of their neighbors could be trusted to help. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the calm from his position on the ridge. Sir, the vehicles have stopped about half a kilometer out. Looks like they're dismounting troops. I count at least 30 fighters now. Morrison made his decision. Rodriguez, can you make it to the rally point we discussed? Affirmative. Give me 5 minutes to set up some surprises for anyone who tries to follow. Morrison turned to Dr. Hassan and her uncle, an elderly man named Rashid who had been quietly observing everything with intelligent eyes. If we're going to reach this clinic, we need to know the safest route, the one that keeps us away from roads and open areas. Rashid spoke in Pashto to his wife, then to Dr. Hassan, who translated. He says there's a path through the irrigation ditches that runs most of the way to the clinic. It's narrow and difficult, especially in the dark, but it provides cover from observation. How long would it take? For healthy adults, maybe 40 minutes. With wounded and children, Dr. Hassan looked at Thompson, who was standing but clearly struggling. Maybe an hour and a half. Morrison did the math in his head. Rodriguez could delay pursuit for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. After that, they would be vulnerable to being tracked and caught in the open. It was a risk, but staying put was certain death. "We go," Morrison decided. "Rodriguez, execute your delaying action and then catch up with us. Williams, you help Thompson. Carter, you take point with Rashid as guide." What followed was one of the most difficult movements of Morrison's military career. The irrigation ditches that Rashid had mentioned turned out to be a network of narrow channels, some dry, some containing a few inches of muddy water, all barely wide enough for a single person to move through while crouched. They provided excellent concealment from anyone more than 100 yards away, but moving through them was slow, uncomfortable, and exhausting. Thompson, despite Dr. Hassan's excellent medical care, was struggling. The foreline had been removed before they started moving, but he was still weak from blood loss. Williams stayed beside him, ready to provide assistance, but Morrison could see that the young SEAL was pushing himself beyond his limits rather than slow down the group. The children presented their own challenges. They were obviously terrified, but trying hard not to make any noise that might give away their position. The younger one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, had been crying silently since they left the building. Dr. Hassan's cousin carried her most of the time, whispering soothing words in Pashto while navigating the difficult terrain. But it was the imam, the elderly man named Abdul, who surprised Morrison the most. Despite his age, he moved through the ditches with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before. When Morrison asked Dr. Hassan about it, her answer explained a lot. "He fought against the Soviets in the 1980s, she whispered. "He knows these mountains better than anyone." After the Taliban took control, he began helping Americans because he said foreign occupation was wrong, whether it was Soviet or Taliban. Morrison was beginning to understand that the conflict in Afghanistan was far more complex than his military briefings had suggested. These weren't just local nationals or indigenous personnel, as his training manuals described them. There were people with their own histories, their own reasons for choosing sides, their own understanding of what was best for their country. They had been moving for about 40 minutes when Rodriguez caught up with them. His report wasn't encouraging. "Managed to slow them down with some improvised obstacles," he said quietly, "but they're definitely tracking us. Found our exit point from the building, and they're following the trail. We've got maybe 20 minutes before they catch up." Morrison looked ahead through the darkness. According to Rashid, they were about halfway to the clinic. 20 minutes wasn't going to be enough time, not with wounded and children. That was when Dr. Hassan made a suggestion that would haunt Morrison for years afterward. "There's another option," she said quietly. "The path splits up ahead. One way goes to the clinic, but it's open ground for the last half-kilometer. The other way goes to the old Soviet outpost on the hill. It's more defensible, but it's also isolated. No chance of rescue if we get trapped there." Morrison considered the options. Try to reach the clinic and risk being caught in the open, or take a defensive position and hope that help would arrive before they were overrun. "What's at this Soviet outpost?" he asked. "Concrete bunkers, mostly intact. Good fields of fire. But no communications, no food, no water." Williams spoke up. "Sir, Thompson's not going to last much longer without proper medical attention. That 4 helped, but he needs blood replacement and possibly surgery." Morrison looked at the young SEAL, who was leaning heavily against the side of the irrigation ditch. Thompson's face was pale and sweaty, and Morrison could see that he was struggling to stay conscious. "I can keep him stable for a while longer," Dr. Hassan said, "but Williams is right. He needs more help than I can provide with basic supplies." Morrison was facing an impossible decision when Abdul, the imam, spoke quietly in English, surprising everyone. "There is third option," he said, his accent thick but his words clear. "But it requires trust." Everyone turned to look at the elderly man, who had remained mostly silent throughout their movement. "My son lives near clinic," Abdul continued. "He has truck. If we reach his house, he can drive wounded to clinic while fighters go to hill position. Divide targets, increase chances. Morrison stared at the old man. Your son, is he sympathetic to Americans? Abdul's expression was impossible to read in the darkness. My son believes in helping injured people. American, Taliban, Afghan army does not matter to him. He is, how you say, paramedic. Dr. Hassan translated a brief conversation between Abdul and her uncle, then turned back to Morrison. Abdul's son works for the Red Crescent. He has ambulance authority. Even the Taliban usually respect medical vehicles. Morrison realized that, once again, this mission was presenting him with choices that weren't covered in any manual. Split his team, sending some with the wounded to safety while others took a defensive position. Trust the word of an elderly Afghan man about his son's willingness to help American soldiers? But as he looked around at the group of people who had somehow become his responsibility, Morrison realized that traditional military thinking wasn't going to work in this situation. These people had been helping Americans for years, risking their own lives in the process. They had already proven their trustworthiness in the most dangerous way possible. Rodriguez, Morrison said quietly, what's your assessment of pursuit? They're maybe 15 minutes behind us now, moving methodically, but definitely tracking us. Morrison made his decision. We try for Abdul's son. If it works, Thompson and the children get to safety. If it doesn't work, we're not any worse off than we are now. As they began moving again through the dark irrigation ditches, Morrison reflected on how this night had changed his understanding of war, loyalty, and courage. He had started the evening thinking he was leading a simple extraction mission. Instead, he had discovered a network of ordinary people who had chosen to risk everything to help strangers, not because of politics or nationalism, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. Thompson, struggling along beside Dr. Hassan, managed a weak smile. Sir, when we get back, I'm going to tell Sarah about tonight, about Dr. Hassan and her family. I think it'll help her understand why being a doctor is so important. Morrison nodded, knowing that if they survived this night, all of them would have stories to tell that would be hard for people back home to believe. Stories about finding humanity in the middle of war, about discovering that courage and compassion weren't limited by nationality or religion. But first, they had to survive until dawn. And that meant trusting an old man's promise that his son would risk his own life to save strangers, simply because it was the right thing to do.